So let's begin talking about growing early season vegetables. The objectives for today are for you to learn which vegetables are considered early season, to find out why we grow those early season vegetables, to know when to plant these vegetables, to decide if you need to put in seeds or if you're going to have to put plants in the ground, and how to deal with some of the pest problems that might come up. Also, we're going to learn a little bit about season extenders, and at the end, I'm going to give you some tips for dealing with a climate change. Now, what do we mean by early season planting? Well, we're talking about vegetables that are planted in, usually early to mid-spring. And of course, the times are going to vary depending on the weather. Cool season crops are those that grow best and produce the best quality when the average temperature is between 55 degrees and 75 degrees. So you know that's not the heat of the summer, right? They are also ones that are going to tolerate some slight frost, either early frost or late frost. They are also ones that don't do well during the warm weather during middle of summer. Now, there is a large variety of these vegetables to choose from, and you will see that the vegetables are either listed when you look through vegetable planting guides and books, you'll see that they're either listed as cool season or warm season. So obviously our early season vegetables are the ones that are listed as cool season. And you'll also notice that the cool season vegetables are also the ones that we consider our fall and winter planting. But that's a whole nother webinar, so I won't be able to get into that one today. Now, there are several reasons why planting early season vegetables is a good idea. The obvious one is that cool season crops grow best in cool weather. That's what they were developed for. There's a less chance of bolting, which means a less chance of them going to seed. When these vegetables start getting later in their life or when the weather starts warming up, they're going to go to seed because they want to reproduce. And when that happens, the vegetables aren't very tasty. There are fewer pest problems with the early season vegetables because a lot of the pests that we may have in our gardens, they haven't woke up yet, or they haven't come into the area yet. They don't come in until the weather's a little bit warmer. So that's a good reason for planting the early season vegetables. There's less water needed, hopefully, because in spring and early summer, we'll get enough of our own rainfall that you won't have to be out there watering your vegetables. It also helps increase the production in the garden. You don't have just the middle of summer vegetables. You're going to be able to have vegetables in early spring and in the middle of summer and then again in the fall. And there are a lot of varieties of vegetables to choose from. Now, you're probably wondering, well, you're talking about early season vegetables, but what type of vegetables are good for planting early? And the next few slides that I'm going to show you will list many of the early season or cool season vegetables that we can grow. Here is a last list. This is a list of the plants in the brassica, and a lot of people call it the broccoli family. You'll hear most people just say the broccoli family. And that includes broccoli, bok choy, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi, turnips. Now, that's a lot of different vegetables to choose from, and that's only in the brassica family. And of course, you're going to want to plant the ones that you and your family like the best. And I will tell you, in my family, that is not going to be kale. So here are a few tips about growing plants in the brassica family. The soil temperature for germination and for the root growth on these brassicas is anywhere from 55 to 75 degrees. They will germinate at a lower temperature, but it will be a slower germination. You won't be able to get them to grow quite as quickly if you're at 45 degrees or a little lower than that. You will find that some of the vegetables in the brassica family need to be put in the ground as plants and not direct seeded. And that means you're either going to purchase the plants or you're going to start them yourself. Now, if you start the plants yourself, you're going to need to have to look through the publications that I mentioned, or look on the seed packet that you buy, or look through the seed catalog that you may be purchasing them from. And it's going to tell you when you need to start the seeds to be sure that they're going to be the correct size when it's time to put them in the ground, to put them into the garden. And I will talk about that more a little bit later. So brassicas are also cold hardy at maturity, and that's one of the reasons why the brassicas also really work well for a fall crop too. One thing you need to be careful of is that a lot of the insect pests that you'll find on the brassicas are the same color as the leaves. So before you go out there in the garden and pick a piece of your broccoli and just start eating it, I may be able to, you need to check around and make sure those little green aphids aren't sitting on your broccoli leaf before you eat it. Succession planting works really good for brassicas, and that means that you're going to plant some of the plants and maybe 2 weeks later plant a couple more, 2 weeks later plant a couple more. That way they aren't all going to be ready for harvesting at the same time. Now, you'll also find that there are some season-specific cultivars, which means if you look through a lot of the seed catalogs of where you're purchasing them, it might say this is a good spring brassica or this is a good fall planting brassica. So that's one thing you might want to check out and look at. All right, root vegetables are a great cool crop to grow, and they are also, some of them are some of the easiest there is to grow. And that can include beets and carrots and potatoes and leeks and onions and radishes. Now, here are a few tips for growing the root vegetables. The best temperature for germination is between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll notice that that's quite a bit cooler than when I talked about the brassicas being between 55 and 75. So you know if you're in a cooler area, your root vegetables probably be able to go into the ground a lot sooner because they will be able to germinate and grow at a lower temperature. Now, the germination rates are going to vary. For example, radishes can quickly germinate, sometimes in just a few days. That's why it's so much fun to grow those with children. But carrots can take a lot longer, sometimes as much as 21 days. That's 3 weeks you're waiting for those carrots to come up. So you don't want to get discouraged. You need to know that it might take them a long time. Now, if you're going to put in your root vegetables, you're going to want to make sure that that soil is light and fluffy and really workable, because you want the roots to be able to penetrate all the soil layers that you're going to have. Now, most of the root vegetables are going to be planted in the garden as seeds. You're going to direct seed them into the garden because the root is what you're going to be eating. So you don't want to disturb it after it begins to grow. Now, there is exceptions, of course, and that's with onions, which they can either be started by seeds, in a greenhouse or in your house, and then transplanted into the garden. Or some of them are put in as bulbs, or what we also call, sometimes you'll hear them called onion sets, or sometimes you'll hear them called onion starts, and that's the little bulb that you're going to be planting in the ground. The potatoes, they're going to be planted as the tubers. That's how you're going to be planting the potatoes. And the recent thing I just read about potatoes, when you put your potatoes in, you're going to you want to make sure that you buy disease-free potatoes that are ready to put into the garden. You don't want to use the ones you get in the grocery store because those are not certified disease-free. So you're going to want to put the ones that are specifically for planting in the garden. And if we cut them into pieces before we put them in, and you're going to want 3 eyes per potato. Okay, 3 eyes per potato. All right, I got to get off that subject and continue on. The smaller the seeds, they might end up being seeded too thickly. So you're going to end up having to thin the plants and give them so that you can give them more room to grow. Now, be really careful with the competition from weeds, especially the weeds that have a big root system, because what you're going to be is in the ground. You want it to be free of weeds. You don't want those weeds to compete. And root vegetables, like I mentioned, is some of the easiest crops to grow. And you can leave some of the mature roots, like carrots, if you leave them in the ground a little longer and you let them mature into the fall, they will become a little bit sweeter. Now, leafy greens are also cool season vegetables, and that can include lettuce, green onions, Swiss chard, bok choy, mustard, spinach, and arugula. Now, some of you may already know this, but arugula is actually in the brassica family. But most of the time when you see it listed, it seems to be listed along with the leafy greens. So that's why I listed it here instead of putting it with the brassicas where it actually belongs. All right. The soil temperature for germination for these leafy greens are anywhere from 40 to 60 degrees. You can either direct seed them into the garden, or you can grow them first or purchase them and put them in as transplants. Now, because of they're all leafy and they're green and the way their lettuces and all of these are, they may need some shade later in the season. So you might have to cover them and give them a little bit of shade, maybe with a shade cloth. Or if you plant your leafy greens on the north side of a taller vegetable, then they will get a little bit of shade. If you're going to plant lettuce, the leaf lettuces are the easiest to grow versus the head lettuce. But still, hey, I've had some good success some years. I should say I've had good success with head lettuce. So if that's what you want, give it a try. Succession planting is perfect for all your leafy greens because you want to plant some and then a couple weeks later plant another, some more and another. They mature pretty fast. So you want the nice, young, succulent ones. So continue succession planting them. Try to avoid water on the leaves. That will bring in some of the diseases. Once again, if you seed thickly, you're going to have to thin the plants. And if some of them are very, very small seeds, and you might want to use seed tape. And I am going to have a slide on seed tape in a little bit too. And we can't forget about peas. You can grow snap peas and snow peas and freezer peas. The germination rate is really big for peas, anywhere from 40 to 85 degrees. That's a long distance, isn't it? If you're going to grow climbing peas, you're going to need some type of support for them. The nice thing about peas is they do tolerate a light frost, but keep picking your peas. Pick them often because if you let them over mature on the vines, the plants are going to shut down. They're going to think that you don't want them anymore, that you want them to reproduce. So they're going to shut down. So keep picking them. And one thing about peas is they do have low fertilizer needs. They are what we consider a nitrogen fixing plant. And what that means, all the legumes, such as the peas, they form this symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that's in the soil that converts atmospheric nitrogen into a form that's usable for the plant, which means that they're providing their own nitrogen needs through their root nodules. So that's a nice thing about peas, that they are nitrogen fixing. Now, remember I said that a benefit of growing early season vegetables is that there are less pest problems. And that is true to a point. But of course, there are some insects and diseases that you might run across. And this is a list of just a few of the common ones. Cutworms, you might find some cutworms. And even though we call them cutworms, they're not worms, they're caterpillars. Cutworms are the larva stage of moths, and they chew on your plants. Aphids, yeah, I'm sorry, especially on the brassicas, you're probably going to have quite a few aphids. The carrot rust fly can be a problem sometimes. That's a fly that will lay its egg near the carrot, and then the larva will chew on your carrot. Potato scab is something that might happen, and I wanted to tell you about potato scab. Some people have a little trouble with potatoes because they're always scabby, and then they don't hold over through the winter. Well, the reason is that potatoes are actually one of the vegetables that does not like a really high pH. So if you're going to plant potatoes and you're going to need to raise the pH of your garden, in other words, you're going to put lime on your garden, figure out where your potatoes are going to be that year and don't put any lime in that area. That will help with your potato scab. Leaf miners are a little fly that lays its egg and then the larva goes between the layers in the leaf. That happens a lot on your beet leaves and your spinach leaves, things like that. Cabbage worms, if you grow cabbage, you've probably seen cabbage worms, which again, it's not a worm. I know these names are kind of funny, aren't they? It's actually a caterpillar. And definitely beware of slugs. Now, the way to deal with the pest problems that occur is to use IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. And I'm going to read this slide to you just so you know what IPM means. Integrated pest management is a science-based approach to managing pests using a variety of safe, hear that, sustainable, and effective tactics. Now, a pest can be a plant, like a weed. It can be a vertebrate, That means it can be a bird or a rodent or any other kind of mammal. It can be an invertebrate, which is an insect, a tick, a mite, or a snail. It can be a nematode or a pathogen, which that means it could be a bacteria or a virus or a fungus that causes the diseases. So that's what IPM means. Now, there are 5 major components that are common to all IPM programs. The first one is to identify the pest. If you don't know what that pest is, you're not going to know how to take care of the problem. So monitoring is very, very important. You need to go out there in your garden a lot. Monitor your plants. Find out. You want to catch that guy or that disease when it's just starting and not when it's too late to do anything about it. And then setting a threshold. That means some of you, okay, I'm okay with a few aphids on my broccoli. I just bring them in, I hose them off. I put them in salt water if I'm going to boil them, and I get rid of the aphids. But some of you might just be can't stand seeing aphids. So that's what we mean by threshold. Figure out what your threshold is, and if you really do need to do some management action. And then when you do have to do something, you're going to combine your biological, cultural, physical, and chemical management tools. And you always do the least toxic first. And then the last thing you're going to go do is assess the result after the action is taken to find out if what you did worked. Now, I have 3 resources listed that will give you more information on how to use the IPM strategies, and they will be in your follow-up email, so you don't have to worry about writing them down. 2 of them are publications, and the last one is the 10-minute university webinar that Cheryl Borden did last year through our webinar series. Now, before you plant, you're going to need to be sure that the soil is dry enough. If you try cultivating the soil when it's too wet, it's going to break down the soil structure. So you can determine if your soil is ready to plant by taking the squeeze test. So you're going to put some soil in your hand and you're going to squeeze it. And if you look at the picture on the left, you will see that when this gentleman squeezed it, it stuck together, didn't it? You know that your soil is not ready to plant. It is much too wet. But if you can squeeze it and you open your hand up and you can take your other hand and push the soil apart, then you'll know that the soil is dry enough to plant. But there's one more thing you need to figure out, and that is if the soil's dry enough to plant, you need to be sure that the soil temperature is warm enough for your seeds to germinate. Because remember, we talked about the temperatures for seeds to germinate. So the soil temperature must be warm enough, not only for the seeds to germinate, but it also needs to be warm enough if you're putting a plant in the ground. It has to be warm enough for the roots to also grow too. So what you're going to do is you're going to use a soil thermometer. And you're going to push that soil thermometer into the ground 4 to 5 inches or around the area where the roots are going to be growing. That's how far you want it to be. Then you want to leave it on for about 5 minutes, or actually longer is usually better. Some people 15 minutes, some people a half an hour. And you're going to take the temperature for several days in a row. Do it in the morning because that's the coolest time of the day. Then you'll be able to average out what your soil temperature is. Now, in a couple of the previous slides, I mentioned the temperature for germination. And there are many publications that have soil temperature charts. That's what they call them, soil temperature charts. This chart that you see here is from the OSU publication, Vegetable Gardening in Oregon. And you'll notice that it lists the minimum temperature range for each crop and the optimum range also. Now, by looking at a soil temperature chart such as this one and taking your soil temperature, you can be sure that when you do put those plants in the grow, they're going to be able to grow really, really well. Now, remember, some of these plants are going to be direct seeded and others are going to be put in as transplants. But these soil temperature charts that are from your own area where you're living, like this one is from Oregon right here in the Willamette Valley, this chart, it will take into consideration whether you're putting in seeds or whether you're putting in plants. And they know which ones, which one, excuse me, which ones you're going to have to grow. Now, not only can you use the temperature chart, you can also use a planting chart, and that will tell you the optimum dates for planting certain vegetables in your area. Now, of course, this may vary from year to year depending on the weather and your soil conditions. This sample chart is also from that same OSU publication, Vegetable Gardening in Oregon. Now, it has the planting dates for different regions in Oregon. So if those of you that are living in Oregon, but not here in the Willamette Valley like I am, this is going to be a really good chart for you. It'll tell you when to start your seeds indoors for planting outdoors. And it also lists the ones that are not suitable for starting indoors. So if you look at this chart and you look down to broccoli, it will tell you that you need to start your broccoli from seeds indoors 6 weeks before planting them out. And that will tell you if you live on the coast, you can plant them out sometime between May and June. If you live in the Willamette Valley, we plant our broccoli around March. And then if we're going to use the broccoli for a fall and winter crop, we plant them in August. So this is also a really good chart for those of you getting ready to plant your early season vegetables. Now, don't forget seed catalogs. Even if you're not going to order from them, they have a lot of really good information. And it's always nice to get those seed catalogs in the mail around December when the weather's cold and wet. Oh, it's so lovely to look through those, isn't it? Not only are they going to give you that information, but if you look online, they'll even have customer reviews talking about certain crops. So that's really, really helpful. Now, I've written down an example of the type of information that you're going to find in a seed catalog. The writing that you see on the screen right now is about the snow crown cauliflower. And I will tell you that is the kind that I grow every year just because of all this good information. It tells you that it's a hybrid and has really vigorous growth, that it's one of the easiest of all the early cauliflower varieties to grow. It tells you that it's 7 to 8 inches across, weighs 1 to 2 pounds. It tells you that it maintains its prime eating quality for up to 10 days in the garden. That's good to know. And also you might want to know, especially if you're worried about it, that it will have a little delicate pink blush when it's maturing in hotter summers. So it's getting ready to probably go to seed. So really good information in these seed catalogs. Now your seed packet will also give you lots of good information. This packet tells about the seed depth, the seed spacing, the soil temperature that's best for germination, and the days it's going to take it to germination. It also tells you how to sow the seeds along with the fertilization tips and even some insect prevention tips. This seed packet here specifically talks about the carrot rust fly maggots and that they may be a problem. And it says to cover the rows with a floating row cover at the time of planting to help control the fly. And I'll talk more about floating row covers in a few more slides. See, there's a lot of information out there that you can get from seed packets also. Now, I have mentioned this before several times, but before you plant your crops, you're going to need to know if it's best that you plant the seeds or if you need to put in the transplants. And as I mentioned before, transplants can either be grown by you or they can be purchased. The publications, the seed catalogs, the seed packets that I mentioned will give you the information you're going to need to decide the best way to grow your crop. So if you look at this, you'll see that it's best to plant seeds straight into the garden. Your carrots, your peas, your lettuce, your kohlrabi, the greens, the kale, the beets, the radish, those go good. They do really well by direct seeding. Your cabbage, your broccoli, your cauliflower, and there's a few others, they need to go in as plants. Putting the seed in the garden, you're not going to get, it's not going to mature enough for you to eat. But then there are a lot of these that you can either put in as seeds or plants. A lot of people do. The kale, the kohlrabi, the lettuce, the greens, the peas, the leeks. Sometimes they put them straight in as seeds. Sometimes they grow them and put them in as plants. And then, of course, the onions and potatoes, like we talked about before, the potatoes you're going to put in the tubers, and the onions, you can either start them, put them in as plants, or put them in as onion starts. Now, if you have large seeds, like your radish and your beets and your peas, it really is helpful for germination if you pre-soak them. So you can soak them in water a few hours before you plant them, or even overnight. You can soak them in water, and it really helps increase the germination and gives it a head start too. Now, this is what I talked about when I mentioned I was going to talk about seed tape. Some of the seeds are so small that it's sometimes hard to plant them in the ground. It's just the right spacing. And if you plant them too thick, you're going to end up thinning them. And that sometimes can be really difficult, or sometimes we forget to thin them, and then they don't have enough room to grow. And that's where tape can help. You can purchase the tape, or you can make your own at home using 2-ply toilet paper. Now, we have a video made by our very own 10-Minute University presenter, Priscilla, that will show you how to make your own seed tape. And I have that information will be in the following email to you. This adorable little girl that you see happens to be Priscilla's granddaughter, and she loves making seed tape with grandma. Now, you probably heard the word season extenders, especially when talking about early season gardenings. But what are they? So, season extenders are any method that allows a crop to be grown beyond its normal outdoor growing season. That makes sense. They named this perfectly. Season extenders extends the season. That's easy to remember, isn't it? So some of those season extenders include raised beds, cold frames, high tunnels, black plastic mulch, row covers, cloches, things like that. Now, they either will warm the soil or they will warm the air around the plants, or some of these season extenders do both. What they do is they create this nice little microclimate that's perfect for the plants to grow in. Now, let's talk about each one of them. Raised beds are considered a season extender because the soil in the raised beds will warm up quicker than the soil in ground gardens. That means that the raised beds will allow earlier planting. I grow in the ground, and I have friends who have raised beds, and they can get their early season vegetables in their raised beds sometimes 1, 2, sometimes even 3 weeks before I can get mine into the ground because my soil is still too wet. Now, there are a lot of different types of frames that are available, but you don't even have to have a frame to be considered a raised bed. Just raising the soil up in a mound is considered a raised bed. And OSU has a publication called Raised Bed Gardening that'll give you a lot more information about growing and growing inside of raised beds and how to build raised beds. Now, cold frames extend the growing season. They extend it either at your planting time to give the plants a head start, or at the end of the growing season to extend the growing season. They're built using some type of a frame. And the top is either glass or plexiglass or greenhouse plastic, and they have it hinged so that the top lifts up and down so that it helps with air circulation if it gets too warm. Now, if you don't have access to a greenhouse or you're not able to start your seeds indoors, cold frame can really work well for this. And what you're going to do in that instance is you're going to put a bottom on the cold frame, and then you will be using a propagation mat, and that will be heating the soil and heating the seed starting mix that you have, and that will help your new plants that you're planning to grow. If you're using it without a bottom, like it shows in these two photos, then it can be just put directly over the plants. And it still is like a little greenhouse effect. It'll keep them warm and help the plants grow. Now, floating row cover, a lot of you, when it first started to come out, it was made by a company, Remay. So you might still hear a lot of people say, I'm going to use some Remay, but it's actually, technically, we call it a floating row cover. And it is a garden fabric, and it's white and it's thin. It's really a light piece of material, and it's typically made from either polypropylene or polyester, and it does not absorb moisture, but it does also allow rainfall and sunlight to pass through it. So floating row covers not only warm the soil, but they also warm the air. And depending on the publication that you read, the air inside of a floating row cover like that can raise the temperature anywhere from 6 to 8 degrees. And that is quite a bit when we're talking about the needs of a plant. Now, floating row covers can either be laid over the plant, like the picture on the left. You lay it over, you have to leave enough room for that plant to grow. And then, of course, you're going to have to hook the sides down so it doesn't blow away, and then check it often, monitor for pests and diseases. or you can attach it to a frame like the picture on the right shows. So make a hoop of some type to attach your floating row cover for. And oh, and I also wanted you to know that one piece can last multiple seasons. It's not a use one time and throw it away. So if you're careful on how you use it, it can last for many, many seasons. Now, a cloche is a French word meaning bell, and you can see that beautiful little bell there. We use cloches as covers for the plants that need extra protection from the elements. And they can be purchased, or as the photo on the right shows, you can actually make your own cloches from milk cartons with the bottom cut off or any other type of translucent container. And we use those just to cover an individual plant that may be in danger of cold weather and need just a little extra protection. But that's a single cover for a plant. Now, when considering growing early season or warm season vegetables, you need to think about crop rotation. Okay. Rotating the crops will improve the nutrients and the soil organic matter if you don't have the same crop in the same place all the time. It will also help to disrupt the crop pest life cycle. If a certain crop gets, oh, let's say, gets flea beetles, you want to make sure that you move them to another area because those flea beetles overwinter in the soil, and so do cucumber beetles. So you don't want that same crop in that same area. So it will also limit the soil-borne vegetable diseases, and it reduces your chemical use. Now, these are photos of my vegetable garden. I'm fortunate enough that I have enough room that I can grow a lot of vegetables. I have 3 in-ground beds that are 25 by 45 feet each. So for me, it's easy to have a 3-year crop rotation. My early vegetables grow in one square. The next year they go in the other square, and the third year they go in another square. So they're never in the same, they're never in the same square. 3 years in a row, then they're in the same square again. Now, um, I don't want to put, but I have to be careful about that. I still have to think about the crop families because I don't want to put my tomatoes in the same spot that I had my potatoes the year before because they're in the same family and they can have the same insect and pest issues. So that brings me to my next slide, garden journals. This is something that I do, so I know exactly where I planted each crop the previous year. Maybe some of you already keep a garden journal, but for others, maybe it's something you don't want to do. Okay, that's totally up to you. Keeping a garden journal can be really elaborate or it can be very simple, whichever you prefer. The main reason for writing down this information is that so you can have your garden layout. You can record what varieties did really well that year, or which ones did really poorly, or which ones you could not stand the taste of. Make sure you don't grow those again the next year. You can also write down the pest and disease problems so that you know you can get ahead of that the following year. Maybe you want to write down the weather notes. Did we have a really wet spring? Did we have a really hot summer? Did this not grow good because of the weather or something, other reasons? And then it helps you to make your plans for the next year. Now I'm going to change the subject a little bit. As we all know, our climate has been and is changing around the globe. This makes for more challenges when you're growing your vegetables and other plants. And this change in the climate may affect when and how you plant your early season crops. So here are a few changes that have been noticed in recent years. Sometimes we get more heavy rainfall events, and we're starting to call those the atmospheric rivers, which will cause more major flooding. Okay. Sometimes we have more frost events, earlier frost or later frost. Sometimes we have longer periods of heat and drought. And then sometimes we can have hotter temperatures, which we're now calling heat domes that come over. There are years with lower precipitation. And because of all this, we've noticed that we have an increase in insect activities because of the different changes in our climate. Now, there are things we can do in our gardens to help overcome some of these challenges. If we're having a heat event, you might have to use some shade cloths to cover your plants. You'll probably want to do some succession plantings. What if it's really hot and you planted every one of your lettuce seeds and then it got really hot and you didn't, and then you had no lettuce? But if you plant them every 2 weeks or so, maybe we had a little drop in the heat. And so you know that that group of lettuce is going to do really good. That's what we mean by succession planting. You're going to want to use a drip or soaker hose to help save water. But sometimes if you overhead water your plants, it will help cool them down a little bit if it's really, really hot. If you're having a rainy season, you can use the plastic tunnels to keep the rain off the plants. You can cover the ground. That will help prevent the soil saturation, and using a no-till or minimum till to help save the soil structure. Now, if you're worried about frost, those floating row covers that warm the plants in the soil work really good. And if you have a really, really sensitive plant that you're worried about, you can even purchase a frost blanket, which is even more powerful than floating row covers. And for insect problems, just keep your vegetable as stress-free as possible and get out there and monitor your plants as often as you can. And that's all I have for you today. So I will see if Cheryl has any questions for me.
I love that, Jane. And I really liked your comments about climate change because I think it's something we're all dealing with as we're down in the dirt in our gardens,
Yeah.
noticing differences that we haven't noticed before. So I thought those were really great tips. And we do have a few questions from our participants today.
Good.
Since we're talking about climate change, I'm going to do that question first. Have you noticed any one particular insect that is more prevalent now that you've noticed a little bit of climate change, or is it just general?
Okay, I don't know if it's from climate change. People have been talking, and this hasn't not have to do with early season vegetables. People have been talking about squash bugs, that
Mhm.
they've had problems with squash bugs. I never had problems with squash bugs until 2 years ago. Was my first time that I had problem with squash bugs. I don't like squash. I only like zucchini, so I only have summer squash. But I did notice that I'm having a lot more problem with the squash bugs. Whether that's just that they finally came into my area or has to do with the climate change because the weather's warmer, I'm not sure. But that is one of the insects I have noticed in my own garden.
What's your best method for sleuthing out squash bugs early?
Really monitoring them. Get them when you look at your plants all the time. And when you see their little eggs, and they're so easy to see, they're beautiful, copper colored. You need to scrape them off or somehow get those eggs off. Um, and then when they finally hatch out, I tried to smother some of them with water, um, try to get the big ones and throw them into some, soapy water, things like that. There's a
Okay.
lot of little methods out there that you can try.
Right. I just think being really vigilant is a huge step in the right direction. The sooner you catch them, the less of a significant issue they'll be for you.
Exactly.
We had a companion planting question, and I know lots of times we feel like some of the companion planting evidence is kind of anecdotal, but this person wanted to know about some good root vegetable companion planting to try to eliminate squash bugs, ironically. So,
Oh,
is it true, do you think that chives and mint and oregano and marjoram planted among your root vegetables might decrease the number of squash bugs?
I haven't tried it, so I can't say that it is. I agree with you, might, and it might be worth a try to see if it works. Um, One thing about companion is a little bit different than companion planting, and that is what do they call it? The crop. I can't think of it.
Okay.
When you bring in another crop so all the bad things go to that crop
Oh,
instead
an
of the
attractant. So you just kind of have a trap crop. So like
right,
planting
right, a
nasturtiums, for
trap crop.
example.
I couldn't think,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I
So a
couldn't think of
crop
the
that
name
will
of it.
trap the insects are more drawn to it and then leaves your other
Right.
crop alone.
And more to me, what works better instead of companion planting is bringing in insectary plants that will bring in the good guys.
I agree. Yeah.
That way, if you bring in the more good insects to help control the bad insects, and that's by having different types of flowers and different types of insectary plants in your garden too.
And that's a balance for everybody. So you're also having good pollinator plants too, because many of those insectary plants are good pollinator plants. So they will also
Yes.
pollinate your vegetables. So that's an excellent point, I think. Everybody's really anxious, and I know we got a couple questions about this. Okay, what should I start? I try to start my seeds in late January, early February to put out in the garden, and I think you're going to say what I think I would say about that is maybe we're getting too anxious, too early.
Yeah, definitely too early. Those seed packets and the seed catalogs and that gardening vegetable garden in Oregon, or if you're in a different state, you'll have the same type of information. They'll tell you, 6 to 8 weeks before you plant them in the garden, or 2 to 4 weeks. I know I had trouble. I wanted to plant some cucumber plants instead of seeds, and I was planting them too early, and then they were just too out of control. By the time I put them in the garden, they got transplant shock. So
Oh,
I finally learned to read a little bit better, and I don't plant them as early as I think I should.
yeah, yeah. And I guess I've never been punished for planting something a little bit late, but I certainly have been punished when I planted something too early.
That's
So
a really good point.
yeah,
Yes.
so and this is a question many people probably have. And the question is, when you were talking about potatoes and how you cut them in, so there's a couple, two, three eyes, and then do you plant them up or do you plant them down? And the same for asparagus. And I know plants are pretty smart, but if one person has that question, other people's have that question too. So
Yeah. You plant them up, right?
so yeah, yes, the eyes need to be pointed up.
Yes.
Ideally, the eyes are up.
Yes.
Now, if
Eyes
you
need to be
planted them
planted
the
up.
other way, they would find a way.
Yes.
Plants
Yeah,
are clever.
they are. Yeah.
And I really love that you answered the carrot fly problem. There was one person who said they had heard that if you thin your carrots or make sure you plant your carrot seeds 1 inch apart, that you would not have the carrot rust fly problem. Have you ever heard that? I had not ever heard that.
Never heard that, but it does make a little bit of sense because it's probably the fly's probably laying eggs on this carrot, and maybe if there was another carrot really close to it, they'd say, "Oh, okay, I'll do that
Just
carrot
pop
too."
from
But if
one
it's
to another.
farther away, maybe they would avoid it.
Okay, that's good.
And an inch apart is good anyway, especially for the size of your carrots.
If you
Help them,
want a decent sized carrot, right?
yeah, gives them room to
But
grow.
floating row cover works well it's like a barrier kind of thing, I know.
Right? As long as they can't get underneath it.
Back to the seed packets. One person wanted to know, does the number of days on the seed packet include the germination period? They want to know,
It
does that?
depends. It depends on the seed packet. Some of them don't say a whole lot. Some of the other good companies will have a lot more information, and they'll tell you, they will specifically tell you when to plant the seed, to plant it out, how many days to germinate, or how many days until it's ready to plant in the garden if you're going to put it as transplant. Uh, it depends on the seed company.
Okay, so
Yeah.
be a little bit discerning when you're buying your seed. So make sure
Yeah,
it fully
yeah.
explains
And
what
if
you
it
need.
doesn't say it on that packet that you really want that packet, doesn't say anything, then go look at that information from a different catalog or somewhere else.
Okay, so
See what
double
they
check.
say.
It's probably wise to double check it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you did mention one of the strategies for climate change when it's extremely hot is to, water your plants so they can cool down a little bit.
Mm.
Timing on the watering, is it important what time of day you would do that cool down? Would it be evening after it's been a really hot day or in the early morning?
No, you'd want to cool them down during the heat of the day. And this is on one of those myths. People think that if they water their plants when the sun is shining and hot, it's going to burn the plants. It
Uh-huh.
does not. That is a myth. So you can put water on a plant in the middle of the day when the sun is shining on it, and it will not burn the leaves of the plant. It will cool it down a little bit. You don't want to water late at night because then it might cause more diseases as they don't dry out overnight.
We just got a squash bug tip, which I think is kind of a cute one. Use a handheld battery-powered vacuum to suck up the squash bugs off your leaves if you miss them in
Oh,
the egg stage. So that's a good idea. Excellent
good
idea.
idea.
So thanks for sharing that. Yeah. When this person wants to know, when using a cloche that is like maybe solid, like a glass cloche or something, what's best practices for making sure moisture doesn't get too great inside that cloche?
Yeah, you're going to have to probably, you're probably going to end up, I think most of the cloches, especially the glass ones, like that glass one, didn't have a opening in it.
Oh,
It was more for
mhm.
decoration. But if you make your own and you use a milk jug, you're going to take the top off so that it won't get all that moisture
It will
inside of it.
dissipate as time goes
Yeah,
by.
yeah.
Okay.
Or poke holes in it or something. And if you have a glass one you want to use, lift it off the ground on one side a little bit. There needs to be a little bit of air circulation. You can't completely enclose it.
I put a little piece of wood under one side when I see a lot of moisture collecting. It's just works.
Perfect.
The individual that asked about potatoes, which way to plant potatoes, also wants to know about asparagus. So when you're planting asparagus, do you
I
know the
don't
answer?
know the
I
answer.
don't
I
plant
planted
asparagus.
my asparagus so long ago, I can't remember. Um, if anybody else knows,
Put
let
it
us know.
in, and also put that question, send it to 10minuteu
Yeah,
2017 at gmail.com, and Jane will answer that question. She'll look it up and answer it. Okay, crop rotation. They all understood that you need to change crop, make sure that the families are separated. Do the
right.
beds need to be a certain distance? Is there a rule of thumb for how distant the bed in the rotation needs to be?
I haven't read that there is. I
Just so they're
haven't.
not planted in the same place that they were
Right.
planted in
Yeah.
the previous year.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine a couple feet away. But it depends. Some people have to plant their stuff really close. They don't have as much room. You can see in mine, I have enough space in between the rows that I can get them farther apart. But some people don't. So do as best you can. That's all we can say. Get them as far away as you possibly can,
And
and good
call,
luck.
yeah. This is a good question, another seed packet kind of question. So maturation date, maturity date, is that from the germination date or the transplant date? Now, if they've got a decent sized plant and put it in the ground, it's going to be different than what they read on a seed packet.
Yeah. Gosh, I
That's
should
a,
have thought about that before.
so
I think it's from beginning to the end. I mean, I think
I
it's
would
from
think
the seed being planted. Yeah.
to
If
the
it
very
takes you
end.
6 weeks, if it takes you 6 weeks to put in the ground and it's 30 days till it's mature, then or 80 days till it's mature, then you add that onto it. Yes. Yeah, I believe that's what they are talking about.
That's what I would agree with you, Jane. I think that is absolutely true. And of course, you just want to make sure that you harvest your crop at its peak, not that it gets is left on too long. I think that's what they're
Right.
thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, somebody
Yeah.
did answer. Anthony did. Asparagus needs to be
Good.
planted properly with the crown up and the legs spread out.
Thank
So,
you.
thank
Good.
you, Anthony. Um, all right, so I think I have just answered, I've just asked you every question that I jotted down, and everyone is you've inspired everyone, Jane. Everybody's going to be dashing out to buy seed packets and get things planted. And we're getting a lot of information about asparagus now.
Good,
So
good.
that's
Well, if
good.
anybody has any more questions, please do put them in the 10-Minute University email address and we'll
And
try to
we'll get
answer
them
them for you.
answered. Yep,
Yes,
that finishes questions for me, Jane. Thanks so much for a wonderful
thank
session. And you know so
thank
much
you.
about gardening. We appreciate you every minute, every bit.
So do you, us together, Cheryl. Together, I
Teamwork.
think we can figure it out. Thank you, everyone, for
Thanks.
watching.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.